Hi everyone, it's so lovely to see you all here, and I'm happy to announce it's only 30 minutes until wine. So I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Dr. Fiona Reilly, and I'm a paediatric emergency physician at the Lady Cilento Children's Hospital. At least that's what I like to tell people, because I have a confession to make. I'm a woman who leads a secret double life. For 2 weeks out of every 4, you can find me in emergency at the Lady Cilento, wondering whether that toddler in bed 3 who's fallen off the sofa and cracked his head on the tiles is going to need a CT head or not, and if so, how the hell am I going to make him lie still for 3 minutes? Or wondering whether my gastroenterology and mental health colleagues have had a chance to see the boy in the next bed, a 13-year-old who's presenting with his 9th deliberate button battery ingestion today. Or wondering whether the vomiting girl in bed 7 who's got hypoglycemia has had her blood sugar normalised now after ondansetron and a super duper. And then the red phone rings, and all that mental real estate gets compressed into the smallest of boxes to make space for the next big thing coming in by ambulance, lights and sirens. I'm sure that day is familiar to many of you, and that's my day as an emergency doctor in a big children's hospital. But on the other 2 weeks out of every 4, you can find me alone in a small, quiet room underneath my house with no red phones, no interruptions, and no sick kids. Because on those days, I'm not a doctor, I'm a writer. Just me alone with the thoughts in my head. Now, I didn't always live this double life as a writer and a doctor, and I thought it might be interesting to tell you the story of how I got there. It's not a straightforward story, but here's how it begins. That's me, circa Christmas 1978, with my brand new Casio watch, of which I was extremely proud. The only people laughing are those who remember that Casio was a company that made watches. I was never one of those kids who spent all their spare time writing stories and wishing that I would grow up to be a writer. I was actually a kid who was interested in 2 things only, namely reading and cooking. I read everything: comic books, science fiction, IKEA catalogues, dictionaries, and I started cooking at the age of 6, and by grade 8 I was throwing dinner parties and charging my mates $1 to attend. And through high school, my interest in those things only expanded. I went from comic books to literature, and I threw ever more elaborate dinner parties, but I still charged my friends $1, sometimes $2. And so at the end of high school, my parents and the school guidance counsellor got together and thought that with those aptitudes, that the very best thing for me to study naturally was medicine. And as I became a medical student and then a junior doctor, you know, the intensity of that work and the long hours meant that those interests that I'd had got shoved to one side and then forgotten altogether. I became interested instead in becoming an emergency doctor because I loved trauma and I spent many years working in aeromedical rescue. And so, after years and years of study and hard work, I finally became an emergency consultant. And at the age of 31, I thought I had the whole gig really figured out. I had a job that was earning good money in a big hospital. I'd climbed that ladder from medical student through intern all the way up to specialist. I spent my shifts in emergency whizzing around like a rocket, you know, doing 1,000 things at once, as we all do. But at the same time, I was also working all night and sleeping all day. And when I had my first daughter, Bella, followed by my second daughter, Lily, then, as every parent knows, I now had no money. Just this pervasive sense of exhaustion and a sense of hurtling down a highway that I hadn't quite realised I was on. I just wanted it to stop, just for a second, so that I could figure out who I was in all of this and what did I want. But in fact, before I had a chance to figure that out, an escape hatch appeared. A chance to move to China for my husband's work. And so in 2009, I moved with my family to Shanghai for a planned 6-month stay. My first impression of Shanghai was that it was chaotic and incredibly confusing. For a country governed by a strict communist regime, it seemed in fact to have no rules whatsoever. It was the kind of place where you could buy a 10-kilogram box of explosives on the street. And crossing the road or driving in traffic was like a game of chicken, and certainly nobody wore a helmet. They were all building their resilience. But it was also cosmopolitan and vast and historic and very, very crowded. I was quite lost to start with in Shanghai. I didn't speak Chinese, and so I couldn't communicate with anybody there. And even the smallest tasks then seemed very difficult. And then I discovered that I couldn't do my usual work as a paediatric emergency physician, mostly because that specialty didn't yet exist in China. And so having come to China sort of to find myself, I found that I'd lost my identity completely, my identity as a doctor. And until I lost it, I hadn't realised how much I'd come to depend on that identity. So while I struggled and tried to find my feet, I enrolled myself in a photography class because I thought it would be a good way to meet people. And my assignment every week was to walk the streets of Shanghai and take photos and present them back to the rest of the class each week. So after 5 or 6 weeks, although everybody else was taking lots of interesting photos of the architecture and the street life, my photos seemed to have fixated on a common theme, namely food, and in particular, street food. The people who made street food, the street food itself, the shops that sold street food, the markets where you could go and eat street food, and dumplings, my favourite kind of street food. And something from all those years ago when I was a kid kind of softly came back to me, and it seemed sort of right somehow. And what I noticed about these street food vendors is that each of them made one thing and one thing only, over and over, day after day, week after week, month after month, until they had got it exactly right. And I thought there was a real beauty in that, a kind of sense of perfection. And I tucked that idea away. And anyway, now that I could take photos, I started writing a blog. I named it after the street we lived on in Shanghai, Nanchanglu, and it lived in a really obscure corner of the internet populated by Chinese street food obsessives. There aren't very many of us, but we're very passionate about it. And I loved writing that blog, and I really thought that nobody else read it. And one day I was at a party and I met a magazine editor, and when she discovered I was a blogger, she asked if I would blog for them. No, she hadn't read my blog, of course. Nobody reads it. But, you know, I spoke English and that was enough. And so I started blogging for them, and in the way of Shanghai, where there's a very high turnover of expats, I was suddenly and very unexpectedly promoted to having my own weekly column in a magazine. I became the Shanghai Family Matters columnist. I didn't love writing about international schools and air purifiers and first world expat problems, but it really was a great apprenticeship in writing for me. There was a great discipline in taking a single idea and converting it into exactly 500 words every week, week after week, month after month, until I got it right. But it was confronting to realise that after rising to the top of the medical ladder, after 16 years of study and work, I was now right back at the bottom of the ladder again as a junior freelancer earning 18 cents a word. So I kept writing my Family Matters column, and I kept writing my blog that I was sure nobody read. And And as 6 months in Shanghai turned into a year, one day out of the blue, I got an email from an editor at CNN, before it was fake news, apparently, asking if I would write some China travel stories for them. Oh, let me think about that for 1 second. Okay. And so my career as a freelance food and travel writer was born, quite unexpectedly. And so 1 year in China became 2 and then became 3. And in case you think I just had lucky breaks, I didn't. I had lots and lots of failures and rejections. And I learnt to cope better and better with those rejections. But I also worked really hard on my skills as a writer and a photographer so that eventually I could write the kind of stories that I wanted to write, which was about food in its broader cultural context. Like this one for the American food magazine Saveur, or this one for the world's biggest food website, Serious Eats, or this one for a Canadian magazine. And about the same time, I started to live a double life. I spent months in Shanghai writing and travelling China to do stories. And then I spent weeks back in Australia doing a locum in my old job as an emergency physician to earn money, because I hate to burst your bubble, but writing doesn't pay, even when you work for the big guys. And having a really excellent day job like emergency medicine meant that I had a lot of flexibility as a writer to pick and choose the projects that I was most interested in. And so I wrote longer articles and then series of articles, which kind of led me inevitably to thinking, maybe one day I could write a novel. Actually, I had no idea how long a novel was. I had to Google, what is the word count of a novel? It's 80,000 words. So not only had I never written 80,000 words in my life, I didn't actually have a very good idea for a novel. And then unexpectedly, one day in Shanghai, just after the 3-year mark, this idea hit me out of the blue. What if I was to drive around China? No, wait a second. What if I was to circumnavigate China in a camper van with my family and then write a book about it? Sounds easy, right? It turned out to be the most difficult and dangerous 6 months of my life. It taught my children a lot of resilience. That's our little camper van there in remote Gansu province. But over the 6 months and 30,000 kilometres of that journey, China revealed itself as this place of extraordinary beauty and really heart-stopping landscapes and poetic mountains. And then the journey was over, and our time in China was up. We'd now been there for 4 years, and I came back to Australia to my old job as an emergency doctor, and I set about writing my first book. The first draft of The Uncharted Kingdom took me 9 months to complete those 80,000 words. And I did the whole thing in secret, mostly because I was too embarrassed to tell my colleagues, my medical colleagues, that I was writing a book. I thought that they might not take me seriously if I revealed that. But somehow, and I'm not quite sure how, but word in the hospital got out that I was writing a book, and a very strange thing happened. Secret writers came out of the woodwork at Lady Salento. And I realised that I was surrounded by aspiring surgeon crime writers. I don't know why you're all laughing. And social worker novelists and paediatrician poets and psychiatrists who wrote about philosophy and fellow emergency physicians who'd been secretly writing opinion essays for major newspapers for years. And a whole bunch of other people who came and spoke to me one at a time to tell me about this really great idea they had for a novel that they hoped to write one day. They just weren't sure how or where to begin. And I thought to myself, wow, this hospital is heaving with writers and probably with other creative people, and we're all keeping it secret. Why are we doing that? Well, probably because healthcare can sometimes be a very brutal and all-consuming profession. It's one where we value objectivity over creativity. We don't really think there's a lot of space for creativity in our work, particularly as medical practitioners. And we probably really fear that we won't be taken seriously, as though somehow having a creative side might diminish our authority as clinicians. But what if I was to tell you that having a creative side might actually enhance you as clinicians? And what if I was to say that in fact you are all of you already creative storytellers, writers, editors and publishers? Because here's the thing, story is the absolute foundation of clinical medicine. Those stories that our patients tell us, that we call cases or histories, they're stories like any other. They have a protagonist, usually the patient. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end, not always in that order. They have dramatic flashpoints and exciting reversals of fortune, both good and bad. And so when my residents and registrars come to me and say, Fiona, can I tell you a story about a patient? Why do you think they're doing that? It's because they're trying to make sense through story of a whole jumble of information and observations and emotions and data. They're trying to rearrange that into a coherent narrative that makes sense and helps solve the problem of the patient's illness. And once they've done that and then they come to me and tell me the story, they're telling it through the patient's eyes and walking in the patient's shoes. And do you know what that is? That's empathy. So when we craft story, we're actually developing empathy within ourselves. And that's so important as clinicians. The other thing about story is that it's become so important as a cornerstone of clinical medicine that it's now a legitimate field of study in its own right. So the Faculty of Narrative Medicine was founded at Columbia University in 2009 by a professor of medicine by the name of Rita Sharon. And she believed that the care of the sick unfolds in stories. Narrative medicine helps the sick make sense of their illness. It gives them a voice and it empowers them in a way that improves their communication with their clinicians. The other thing about narrative medicine is that when you study narrative medicine, it's been shown that your empathy increases, as does your creativity and your ability to self-reflect as a clinician. So I can foresee a future, maybe in 10 years' time, where our patients, perhaps our most complex patients, not only have their own specialist paediatrician, an oncologist and physiotherapist, but they also have their own specialist in narrative medicine, somebody who will help them and empower them to tell and understand their story and bridge that divide between carer and patient. Maybe sometime in the future we'll also have departments of narrative medicine within our hospital, places where we learn to not only help our patients, but we also help all of our clinicians to be more empathic, more creative, and more self-reflective. So I just want to take you back to the end of my own story. You're probably wondering, how did she resolve that conflict between being a writer and being a doctor, and did that book ever get published? Well, I realised that I didn't have to choose between being a writer and being a doctor. I could, in fact, be both. I could integrate those things. I didn't have to live a double life, I just had to live my own life. The life of a kid who grew up loving cooking and reading, who went on to study medicine, and who ended up going to China and becoming a writer. I realised that being a writer makes me a much better doctor because I listen more attentively, I observe more closely, and I help empower my patients to have the language that they need to navigate the healthcare system. And being a doctor helps me to be a better writer, because as a doctor, I'm privileged to touch those moments of greatest human drama, birth, illness, suffering, and death. And by touching those moments, create stories that tell us what it means to be human, even if those stories sometimes seem on the surface to be about something else, like food or travel. And so my first novel is still hoping to find a home with a publisher, although I recently won a publishing prize with Penguin Random House, so I've got my fingers crossed that that might still happen. But in the meantime, I'm not going to stop. I kept writing, and I've started a master's at QUT in creative non-fiction, and I'm midway through my second book project, which is a journey through the Middle East to discover the world's oldest recipes. And all that street food writing and street food eating did eventually pay off. Although this is not my book, I was really excited to contribute a few chapters to the World Atlas of Street Food, which is actually being published next week in the UK and the US. And so for those of you sitting there wondering, well, how can I give power to that creative urge that perhaps we all have inside us? I just want to tell you one last short story. My teenage daughter, Bella, texted me about a meme. Now, I'm embarrassed to admit that I'm not totally clear about exactly what a meme is, but the meme was about your favourite book from childhood, and the problem was that Bella couldn't remember her favourite book from childhood. So I asked her, was it Where is the Green Sheep? And I'm sorry if that image traumatises any of you with small children. No, she said no. I said, was it Dig, Dig, Digging? No, it had an elephant in it. I said, oh, was it Baba the elephant? No. And so she and I spent fruitless weeks searching through the house, through all the books on the bookcase and in her bedroom, looking for this elusive book which we couldn't find. And we spent hours on the internet looking for kids' stories about elephants, but nothing came up. Now, Bella babysits a little boy called Eli, who's 3 years old, and last week when she was babysitting Eli, he pulled a book out from under his bed for Bella to read to him at bedtime. And you'll never guess, it was the book she'd been looking for. Some of you might know it, The Elephant and the Bad Baby. And as she read it to Eli, all of these memories came flooding back to her, memories of her childhood and memories of the story and how joyful and how naughty it is. It's about this elephant and this bad baby who go on a shoplifting rampage. Through a small village, and then everybody sits down and has pancakes together at the end of the day. But here's the thing, when she finished the story, she discovered her own name, written in her own childish handwriting from many, many years before, in the front cover of the book. And somehow, through means unknown and mysterious, that book had travelled through time and space and probably many people's hands and a few charity shops along the way to get, via Eli, back to Bella. This thing that she'd been looking for so long was actually right there in front of her. And so that's the thought that I'd like to leave you with today. We are all creators in our own lives and creative on our patients' behalf. But you don't need someone else's permission to bring that creativity into the open and give it breath. It is yours. and it was yours all along. Thank you. Oh, thanks. Oh, thanks.
So beautiful. Thank you so much, Fiona. It reminds me, there's a saying, the thing that you are seeking is seeking you. And it was certainly
so
seeking
true.
your daughter. Aidan tells me we've got loads of questions, so I'm going to hold mine, and we're going to find out what
So I think the first thing is that everyone's quite envious of all the travelling and fooding that you've been doing.
all the dumplings.
Oh, they look really good. That's okay, the food here is pretty good as well. So, Damien Rowland wanted to know, how did you get better at writing? Was it persistence, natural talent, training? What did you do, and what can others in the audience do to get better at their writing?
Earlier today, Liz and I were talking about grit, which is a combination of persistence and passion, and I think that really describes the journey of trying to improve yourself as a writer. Writing is a really slow process. You have to be in it for the long haul, but eventually it will reward you in itself. But in the meantime, you could do lots of things to improve your writing. When I came back to Brisbane, I joined the Queensland Writers Centre, which was a wonderful organisation. And they provide short and long and online courses that you can do as a member to improve your writing. The other thing I did was I joined a writing group. And I'm still in that group 4 years later. We meet once a month at the State Library and we read and critique each other's work in a really friendly, non-judgmental, but also very judgmental environment. And I think, don't discount things like writing a blog, writing emails to yourself. All writing matters. And some people say you have to have a regular practice, which means sitting down in the same seat at the same time every day. That's a little bit difficult as a shift worker, and it's one of the reasons I've separated my month into 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. But that can be very important for some people, just being in the right physical and mental space to be ready for writing.
Thank you so much. Another question was, how does one overcome imposter syndrome early on as a novice writer? And that was from Melanie Rule.
I don't know, but if you know the answer to that, can you tell me? I think we all, part of the problem of being clinicians is that we've come to attain a level of excellence in a particular field, and it's very confronting to your ego to go right back to the bottom rung of a ladder in another field. And you just have to throw out all of that. And on my really bad days as a writer, where I got a really crappy rejection letter or no rejection letter at all, I could at least comfort myself with the fact that I had achieved something else in another field, and that helped me deal with the rejection much better. But also, on my worst days in the emergency department, I could think, well, only another 4 shifts, and then I can sit in that quiet room for 2 weeks. But there will be, I think, many months or even years when you feel like an imposter, and even published writers who've published many books, and Matt Condon, the Queensland writer, is a friend of mine and has published, 17 books. Even he says he still feels like an imposter, so it probably never goes away.
Great, thank you so much. And there's the stories being the foundation of clinical practice and medicine has really just taken off, and everyone seems to feel that really resonates with them. So thank you.
That's great.
Fantastic.